Welcome to everyone today for the colloquium by Professor Nitya Rao. My name is Abha Rao and I'm a team member at the Ramalinga Swami Center. And it is an honor to introduce you today to Professor Nitya Rao, who is a professor of gender and development at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, United Kingdom, and the director of the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development. Although she is our first speaker from overseas, and we're very excited at the center about this, she is one whose work is very deeply grounded in India. She has worked extensively as a researcher and advocate in the field of women's rights, gendered well-being, and justice, with a particular focus on food, nutrition, health, and livelihood security. She has published extensively on the gendered changes in agrarian relations, migration, and livelihoods, especially in the context of climatic variability and economic precarity. She has consistently engaged over the decades with policy and practice at both the global and local levels. Apart from supporting networks of women farmers in India, she has served on the Global Advisory Committee of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative for over a decade. She is currently a member of the steering group of the high-level panel of experts to the Committee on World Food Security and Commissioner Eat Lancet 2.0 on healthy and sustainable diets, and a member of the scientific advisory group to the United Nations Food Systems Coordination Hub. I'll end my introduction there. I'm just going to tell all our listeners that you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please put your questions there throughout the talk as and when they arise, and we will pick them up at the end of the talk for our discussion. Our discussion today will be moderated by Sanjana Santosh. Thank you again, Professor Nitya Rao, for being here today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Abha, and it's a real privilege actually to be giving this lecture at the Ramalinga Swami Center of Equity and Social Determinants of Health colloquium series, because I'm not a health and nutrition expert, but I have worked in the field of gender and development for a long time. Particularly, my work has been started with issues of women's employment. When I first started work, I was working with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in Madhya Pradesh, organizing BD workers, but then moved on to agricultural work. And in the last 10 years or so, I think the emphasis or the interest in really food and nutrition security and the puzzles around it have really informed my work. So in today's talk, next slide please, I want to focus on sort of two of the SDG goals, SDG 5 on gender equality and also SDG 2 on food and nutrition security, and to see what lessons can we learn from tribal India, what are the issues there, and so on. So very briefly, I think there has been, of course, since the 1970s, with the feminist advocacy in particular, and Geeta and others have been part of the landmark work of Dawn and other sort of third world networks in this field. There has been a lot of progressive policy change in India. You know, apart from the Panchayati Raj legislation, reservation for women in the early 90s, we've had several other rights to education, right to inherit property, including agricultural land. The National Food Security Act of 2013 was also interesting because it named the senior woman as the rights holder in that act, legal protection from domestic violence, sexual harassment, and so on. Nevertheless, many issues still remain despite this progress. Next, please. So I think one of the things, can you move to the next, Abha? Yeah, thank you. One of the things I think which is really interesting is this chart comes from the Economic Survey of India. It's a government document in 2018. And they introduced this idea of looking at sex ratios, not only at birth, but also of the last child. And I think which is on the vertical axis. So except for a few countries, Meghalaya, Kerala, few in the Northeast, Assam, Manipur, Arunachal, I think most other countries, as far as, in fact, as far as last child is concerned, except for Meghalaya, all other countries, all in states in India do very poorly. And I think this gave them the term that we have been talking of son preference and poor sex ratios and so on. But it really, they coined the term, the government themselves, in presenting the economic survey, of son meta preference, that this is very planned in terms of the discrimination against the female child, especially the last child. So we see in the census that is available, you have a declining child sex ratio of female is to male. In recent, I was just looking at the media and so on, and they have claimed that there has been a reversal in child sex ratios because of government programs like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, and so on. But of course, we don't have any data to really confirm this. So there might have been some reversal, but we don't know. Next, please. When it comes, however, to various global reports, I think we are not doing well at all. So if you look at the Global Hunger Index of 2022, India ranked 107 out of 121 behind most other South Asian countries. And of course, these global reports are increasingly controversial because whenever India does badly, there is always a claim that, the calculation is wrong or the definitions are wrong or something else is wrong. But I think even more worrying is the Global Gender Gap Report, the same slide, yeah,
Sorry.
which, no, that's fine, of last year, which actually ranked India 134 out of 146, but it has various sub-indices. And the health and survival sub-index, actually India was the last. It was 146 out of 146. So it's really quite a distressing situation to see, despite being a middle income country, despite economic growth, as far as Global Gender Gap Report is concerned, we are the last in terms of health and survival sub-index. There are other issues, of course, like the work participation rates and share of earned income, women's share of earned income. India is 143 out of 146, so almost at the bottom. And actually, when I travel in rural India or in urban India, for instance, you don't really see women not working. I think women are working all the time. So there is really a serious issue of either both devaluation as well as invisibility of women's work. Other issues are there, like unequal access to assets, violence, which despite the law, which I said is progressive, has actually persisted. And every day, again, we hear of horrifying stories of violence against women. So next, please. And I think this was just to show you that though these figures are a bit now dated, but just to show that India for some time has been doing in various indices along the double burden of disease, undernutrition, overweight, obesity, anemia, and so on, has been doing worse than its neighbors. I don't know about Afghanistan now because there's 100% food insecurity over the last 1 year, but even Afghanistan was doing much better than India in terms of all these indices. I think the only one was Pakistan over the last few years, which has been doing badly, but Bangladesh, Nepal, countries which may be much poorer, have actually been doing much better than us in terms of health indices. Next, please. So I think this is again from IFPRI. It's a map of all India level. And I think this is very important from a gender lens, that apart from just, rather than just generalizing about men and women or the country as a whole, of course, India is a very diverse country. And this map shows stunting or height for age for under fives. And you can see that there's basically the northern belt, some parts of western and central India, which are doing very badly, while the national average for stunting is about between 22 to 25%. You can see that there are districts in western Uttar Pradesh, for instance, Balrampur, Shravasti, Bahraich, which all have rates of over 60%. I'm not showing the chart, but I have put the figure of similarly for wasting, which is weight for age, that again, globally or even India as a country, maybe it's between 15 and 17% is for under five wasting. But in some of these tribal pockets, we find that it is very, very high. So Dumka, where I work a lot, Purbi Singhbhum, Khunti in Jharkhand, the Dangs in Gujarat, Gadchiroli in Maharashtra, these are some areas where the wasting remains very high. Anemia is very high amongst women. And this has been a puzzle actually for me, because most of these communities, they live in biodiverse areas. They belong to rural farming households. They should have some own production as well. So why is it that these rates of these indicators of nutrition are so poor? Next, please. So I think sort of some of the key questions that I was wanting to look at is really that First of all, what does this data then really tell us about meeting some of these development goals and progress towards development goals, whether it is on gender equality? And of course, now the UN itself has predicted in the last 2 years since COVID and since the Ukraine war that SDG 2 is not going to be met, which is on food and nutrition security, but actually the rates of people hungry or food insecure is going up over the coming years. But also to look at how are these experiences gendered and differentiated by social identity with a specific reference to tribes. And towards the end, I'd like to talk a little bit about how can we address this? How can we think about it both conceptually in terms of an integrated systemic approach to both gender justice and nutrition security, and some of the work that we've been doing in Jharkhand, in Dumka and Jharkhand over the last couple of years. Next, please. So this is just I think this I wanted to sort of start off with. This is not my own conceptual framework, but I took it from the World Food Programme report on food security in India. It's quite old, but I think what's interesting is the yellow blocks, which really say that food security or nutrition security comes because of household food access, which is because of production, livelihood strategies, cash earnings, wages, whatever. But very importantly is also the care or the health practices, which is really within the gender division of labor, comes to women's responsibilities for care, for domestic work, for feeding, cooking, hygiene, and so on. And the third is your broader conditions, the structural context in terms of health and hygiene conditions, whether there is clean drinking water available, whether there is health services available, whom do people rely on, what is the training of the ashas and Anganwadi workers, how well do they function, and so on. So this is your larger public health context. Next, please. Having said that, I think that the first block in terms of food access, I think there has been some thinking and conceptualization around the link, especially in rural India and in rural contexts, about how is agriculture or working in agriculture linked to improved nutrition? What are the possible pathways? So the three sort of from the Sunita Kadiala et al.'s work in IFPRI and London School of Tropical Health and Hygiene, they have sort of identified three major pathways. One is when you're a rural household or an agricultural household, you produce food. So agriculture can be a source of food, but also it can be a source of income, because any surplus that you sell, and this is very common with rural households, that when they need petty cash or when they need cash to purchase other things, especially in tribal India, in the weekly market or weekly hart, women will go and sell small amount of food, whether it is paddy, whether it is locally available fruits or vegetables or whatever in the local market, and earn some money, cash, to then purchase other things. Of course, this agriculture as a source of food and income is limited by, whether you have land or not, what is the seasonality, what are the crops that are grown, and so on. The second pathway is seen around basically prices, food prices and expenditure patterns. And this sort of comes from Amartya Sen's work of food insecurity or under malnutrition being really a distributional problem rather than a production problem. And that is, there's a lack of purchasing power. So when the food prices go up or cash is not available, then people are not able to purchase healthy diets. Very interestingly, the FAO 2021 report, SOFI report, showed, which had a special section focusing on the affordability of healthy diets. And it showed that globally, 3 out of 8 billion people, so more than 1 in 3 globally, cannot afford a healthy diet. So while your poverty lines may be much less, actually the healthy diet is much higher, is almost double of what above the poverty line. So by that calculation, almost 1/3 of the people, and a large chunk of them, of course, in South Asia, cannot afford healthy, affordable diets. There are also issues, of course, with rising health expenditures, with migration, which I'll talk about from tribal areas, which I'll talk about a little bit more. The third pathway, actually, they focused on women's work. And they said that there are 3 ways in which women's work links to nutrition. First is if women are working, so they're earning some money, this can lead to control over money, control over decision making, and it can improve nutrition by improving consumption choices, that women are able to buy what they need for household consumption. A second pathway is in terms of time and time use and time poverty. And I think this has been emphasized by the feminist movement for a long time, by the women's movement, that when women are having their double or triple burdens of work, then actually they may be earning money, but they may not have time for care or for feeding and so on. And I think in India, this remains a huge problem in terms of the very inadequate budget for creches and childcare services. And the third is women's own health, that when they are doing these double burdens, when they're working in farming or doing other paid work and working at home and domestic tasks, actually what they consume may be less than what is actually their energy expenditure or what they use. And this can lead to maternal, also women's, even if not maternal, undernutrition. Next, please. So I think agriculture again is an area where I have been working mainly in rural India after my initial work with Seva in urban areas in Madhya Pradesh. I've more or less been working in the rural areas. And if we look across South Asia again, I think from the women's workforce, more than half, a majority is employed in agriculture. So if we look at these three pathways which Kadyala and others have proposed in terms of how does women's work link to nutrition, the first pathway was around income, that women will be empowered when they gain income, and this can have positive effects. Of course, in India, we know that most women's work in agriculture is what is called as unpaid household work, or they are unpaid workers. They work on family farms and they are not paid. So this income effect is very unclear. The second issue relates to the time poverty, and I will just present some data in a moment of time use study that I had conducted in two tribal areas, one in Maharashtra, one in Odisha. But of course, this was very clear that this had a negative effect on child nutrition outcomes. And the third element is that when we talk about agricultural development, mechanization, farm tools, and so on, actually there has not been much attention or much improvement in terms of the so-called tasks, whether it is transplanting, whether it is weeding, the tasks that women are doing, particularly in these tribal areas. So there is an element of drudgery, there is an element of work intensity, which has potential negative effects on women's own health. Next, please. So before giving the data, I would like to say that, something that I'd said earlier as well, that from a gender lens, of course, and the reason I'm focusing on tribals is that it is not possible in India to sort of talk about women and men as homogeneous categories. Even within particular contexts, we find differences based on seasonality, cropping pattern, what is the household socioeconomic status. So even within tribal areas, those who are landless households versus landed households, those who belong even within tribes, there are hierarchies of better off tribes and worse tribes. And of course, household composition and education makes a huge difference. And I think, one of the budget announcements this year, that for tribal areas to encourage education and so on, which is perhaps okay, that a lot of tribal children will be taken to hostels in block and district headquarters. I think this something really comes as a constraint in terms of women's time, because in rural agricultural societies, when children are at home, they are able to help uh, at least on weekends, mornings, evenings, with some amount of work. But when they are removed physically from that context, when men are migrant, then the entire burden of both care and productive work comes only on women, and there's a limit to how much they can do. What are the prevailing labor market arrangements? I think male contributions, when often we talk about redistribution of care work between men and women, but in many of these 20 years ago, 25 years ago, in the 90s, when I started working in tribal areas in Jharkhand, actually all the men were at home. They never used to migrate. Agriculture was enough to provide for them. Maybe seasonally, they would go from Jharkhand to West Bengal for some paddy work for 2 to 3 weeks, a month at most, and come back home. They took pride as cultivators. Now, when I go back, actually all the men are migrant to Bangalore, to Tamil Nadu, to Kerala, to Maharashtra. They are not there. Their agriculture has become completely viable. So when we talk about redistribution or male contributions, there is also an issue about physical presence or not of men. And the final point, of course, is the arrangements for childcare. So where the woman is alone and just left with a toddler or whatever, then with no other support, then it becomes a problem. If there is an alternate care provider, of course, the impacts on nutrition may not be that severe. Next, please. So when we talk about paid work, so as I said, agricultural work is mostly unpaid in India. Of course, for the landless, for some scheduled caste and people like groups like Parojas who are landless, they do earn a wage from agricultural work, but by and large, it is unpaid household work. The paid work that women get in rural areas now is mostly the NAREGA, the employment guarantee work. And this is not from an area which I have worked in this photo, but from of the Bhils from Udaipur district in Rajasthan. And this was just after the COVID pandemic, actually, when the men were stuck in Ahmedabad. They could not come home. They finally managed to come home. They were very traumatized. They couldn't really work. The NAREGA sites were in a way a saving, life-saving opportunity. But of course, they involve strenuous physical labor. And it's not just work, but in that particular context, it also was a part of women's responsibility for household food security, that unless and until they earn an income, because their men had come home without any incomes, they would not be able to provide food to their families. But I think there's a question about when women are already malnourished, very rigorous or strenuous physical labor, what does it do to their own health? Next, please. So this I mentioned was a small time use and diet surveys that we did with 60 households in 2 sites. One was in Koraput in Odisha, another was in tribal parts of Vidarbha in Maharashtra. And we repeated it with this households across 3 seasons, agricultural seasons: the planting season, the harvesting season, and the lean season. The first thing, of course, was we use the same time use methodology of the Government of India time use surveys in terms of classification and calculation. And this survey was done a little bit before the Government of India time use survey of 2019. So it was not surprising that of the total work, women performed 56%. But what even I was a bit surprised was that from the agriculture or the productive work on the farms, that women did almost 75 to 80% of what men did in both the planting and the harvesting seasons, while continuing to do 95% of domestic and care work. Second thing was that there were clearly time deficits for care during these seasons, the planting and the harvesting seasons, but these were much more intensive for women from landless and marginal households, almost a 30% decline during these seasons. And the other interesting thing was around seasonal weight loss. And there's not been that many studies. There have been a few studies on seasonal weight loss in Africa. And they actually find that men have a greater seasonal weight loss than women. And in this case, it was the reverse, that women lost almost 3 to 4% of body weight during these harvest seasons in particular, when there was reduced consumption because the harvest was not yet in and their food stocks from the previous year were over, but very intense activity. Next, please. And these are just some charts to show, that even within, this is from Koraput, that even within a very sort of backward area, there are some differences which we see within time use. And here, the Parojas, who are the sort of more landless and the bottom of the tribal hierarchy, and the Malis, who are OBCs, but actually vegetable cultivators, the female and male work burden is almost on par throughout the year for men and women in sort of productive work. This is system of national account. So this is only the productive or agricultural work in this chart. So women are also working more than 8 hours a day on agricultural productive work. Next, please. And if we look at the ESNA or the domestic and care work, I think you see, first of all, that the male contributions are low. They are there in some of these groups. And this is, but the kinds of activities when we unpack is very interesting, that men are willing to teach and supervise children, to hold children, play with them, and so on. But cooking and cleaning are exclusively female tasks. And cooking is the most time consuming of all domestic tasks. It takes out of these 5 hours average. And in some of the seasons, as you will see for the Porojas across the year, but for planting season, definitely across groups, that the time available for domestic work comes down from an average of 5 hours to 3 hours. And out of this, even from the 5 hours, about cooking takes about half that time. And so we had a lot of women reporting that actually during these peak seasons, they don't feel like cooking because they are very, very tired. So that again has an impact on nutrition, that often, they just eat some gruel or plain boiled rice or something like that, which is easy to make. Next, please. Men, as I said, I think in tribal areas today, a lot of men are migrant. This is from Jharkhand. The left is a picture working in Western UP in the sugarcane fields. The other is a bus in Dumka station with loads of people trying to leave. They work very harsh hours, no leave, no rest, was virtually 24/7 is the work, and they are away for about 10 months. And when they come back, they're actually so exhausted that they really can't contribute to anything at home. In the case of these sugarcane boys who go, or men who go for the sugarcane, they said that if they work 1 year, the next year they can't go. They have to take rest for 1 year before they can get fit to do this work again. So in a way, health expenditures goes up, but also care of these men becomes an added responsibility in the context of migration. Thank you. Next, please. And the final point is about women's own health. We did some rough calculations on energy intake based on the diet surveys and the activity surveys on how much energy is being expended. And again, you found that both for men and women, and particularly for some groups, I mean, across groups actually, during the harvesting season, they had negative consumption. And I think this shows in terms of the seasonal weight loss that we are seeing. For some groups like the Malis, the women actually, they work very, very hard and they are completely undernourished. Even though they're an OBC group, they have very little voice, and these women have no control over their income, and they also have some of the other constraints, cultural constraints, which I will talk about in a minute. Next, please. And this just shows the sort of changes in mean body weight, which I was mentioning earlier, with the Porojas, who are the poorest amongst the tribal groups. Both the men and women have quite negative figures, but for women it is rather high at 4%, which is seen to be very high in the literature on health and nutrition. Next, please. Okay, the other issues I think which are very important in this context is that, as I said, men are mostly migrant and women seem to have shrinking control over the production systems. This is a landscape from Koraput. Increasingly, we find the effects of climate change, rainfall variability, both the number of days and the timing, declining water table. So what they are getting, there are sudden storms and cyclones. What they are getting in harvest is very, very unpredictable. But alongside this, there has also been shifts in laws and policies, the reservation of forests, and also the common property resources and water bodies. I think there have been changes are being enclosed. In Jharkhand, a couple of years ago, 2018-19, the government, which was still the BJP government at that time, it tried to change very subtly the land legislation to, or reclassify the common property as government land on the revenue register, which would have meant that once it's reclassified as government land, it can easily be taken over for land banks or for other kinds of investment purposes. People in effect lose control over it. And there was a movement actually that when they realized what was going on, called the Pathalgadi movement, where the village panchayats tried to oppose this kind of enclosure, this kind of taking over by sleight of hand of their common properties. In Koraput and all over central India tribal areas, we find an increase in plantation forestry, particularly eucalyptus plantation in the uplands. Now, these uplands used to be used for cultivating millets and also vegetables, horse gram, and other pulses. Several things have happened apart from the state pushing the paper industry, and under CSR, they call it CSR, but I don't see how it is CSR, corporate social responsibility, where they enter into contracts with these tribal people to say that they will provide all inputs and then have these plantations, and they will get lump sum payments once the eucalyptus is sold back to the paper industry. This has had all sorts of effects apart from water tables and the natural ecosystem. Of course, these contracts are made with the men who are technically the owners of the land, but also women lose access to that land for the cultivation of pulses, millets, vegetables, which provided nutrition, but also small sources of income. At the same time, with this enclosure, you find a decline in access to collected foods like mushrooms, bamboo shoots, and other small game and things like that, and an increasing dependence on PDS, which clearly is having a negative effect uh, on nutrition. Even though it is filling, it is very important for survival. So one thing here, which I again just noticed in the various conversations, this is the International Year of Millets, and the government in its budget has promoted millets. But there is a lot of talk about increasing production of millets for exports and so on. And I think that is a trend which we really need to think about. That I think people like us in the middle classes have now shifted to consumption of millets. I think Karnataka is an exception, which gives millets ragi in the PDS, but none of the other states have yet taken this on board. So the poor people for whom millets would be really helpful and it was part of their local diets have now lost it. And if they, I found in Tamil Nadu, in Kolli Hills, again in tribal areas, that those people who do still cultivate millets, most of it is sold because they can get higher prices for millets and purchase cheaper rice from the PDS. So I think there is really a market influence and a resource influence in terms of diets and in terms of nutrition. Next, please. And I think this is an important element which I wanted to talk about, is the influence of religion. Of course, tribal areas have had missionary presence and so on from a long period of time, and they were very remote from colonial times. It was the missionaries who set up schools, hospitals, and so on. I think over the past couple of decades, there has been a growing influence of religion. I think the last 20, 30 years, you saw the killing of missionaries in Odisha, Stains, you saw a lot of harassment and killing also of missionaries in Jharkhand and other states. But what I found interesting not is this controversy, at least the missionaries, I think I'm not defending or saying anything pro or con against them, but I think one thing was that they didn't necessarily intervene in sort of food and consumption practices. Whereas with growing Hinduization, there is an increasing emphasis on food practices. So for both men and women, there is fasting, an increasing fasting, and lot of vrats, and especially for women. I found when I was there in Koraput in September or during the season of Dashera, when a lot of fasting, women are supposed to fast for 1 month. And a person, the Deshari, the local person, said to me that men are also supposed to fast, but because men are the providers and they have too much work, they can, if they don't want to fast, they needn't fast, but women must fast. But again, this assumes that women are not working, but women are at the same time also engaged. September, October is a peak season in terms of beginning of harvest and so on. The other big issue has been in vegetarianism and in giving up, including of small game, which was a source of protein. We recently did some work in Jharkhand where we found that protein deficiency, even with all local produce, is actually becoming a huge problem. And here, I think the social support or the eggs and other things given through midday meals in Odisha at least has been a big support in terms of child nutrition. Um, Prices and availability. I think with this, when you have vegetarianism and so on, apart from sort of purchasing sort of expensive foods which are seen to be vegetarian, nuts and so on, which are not really affordable, I think we find that things like eggs, meat, vegetables, fruits, which are part of healthy diets, are not really affordable within these contexts. Next, please. And of course, this is something which I've already mentioned, that, the school feeding programs, when we look at this, all castes, though scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, the undernutrition remains more across the life course. Even in adulthood, it is very high. It is not only child undernutrition. We are talking about even 52% of adults among scheduled castes and 48.4% in scheduled tribes. But I think the 12 to 17, you really see the impact of school feeding programs and social protection. For many of these children, this is the only food that they have. And I think during COVID, there's possibly a setback that has occurred. Next, please. Okay, so very quickly, I think I would like to go to some of this latest thinking on food and nutrition security. When Abha introduced, she said, I'm a member of the high-level panel of experts. And I think we have in our a report 2 years ago talked about the 4 pillars of food and nutrition security, which is, of course, the right to food, which in India we have, widen the understandings of the dimensions of food security to include agency and sustainability. So I think some of the things around the markets, around export orientation, and the kind of farming that is done in the context of climate change. Andhra Pradesh is now a very good example of community-based natural farming, where they're trying to take account of local people's own ecosystem, their physical environment, their aspirations, their food habits, and so on. And these are very important elements of food security and nutrition. The other is to take a systems lens and also critical policy shifts. Next, please. So this is a diagram. I won't go into it, but from the same report, that we need to look, if we really want to change, look at gender justice and nutrition security. We can't just make a nutrition month or nutrition month, start giving nutrition awareness. One has to look at the whole chain, and this is where gender comes in. From production, what is the production environment? What are the supply chains, value chains? How are consumer behaviors influenced? I was recently in Jharkhand, where actually many of the adolescent girls with whom I was talking, they said that they eat chips and samosa sandwich for school lunch and kurkure. And I said, what about all your traditional foods which are so nutritious? And they said they don't like it. And so I'll just say a little bit more about this, but I think we need to address the problem at all these levels. Next, please. And I think in terms of the critical policy shifts, what is important is that not just to look at food as a separate system, but really from this food systems lens, to look at it as intersecting with other systems of health, of the economy, of markets, of climate, and so on. We need to look at hunger and malnutrition in all its forms, not just hunger, I think, which was the initial focus of the PDS in terms of calorie provision. And really need to move towards a radical transformation, looking at the whole system with context-specific solutions. Next, please. So this is just the link to the paper, but based on this, I've been thinking and working, which was sort of summarized in this article in Nature Food. It was a perspective piece called Achievement of Food and Nutrition Security is Deeply Gendered, but really to look at the physical environment, the social environment, and the institutional environment, including all forms of violence, including those related to food and food deprivation in a collective way. So I'll just briefly, before ending, go through a few things on what we've been doing in Jharkhand more recently. Next, please. So this was in Jharkhand. I had a project on sustainable food systems, and we were really looking at how do we translate it into practice. And the key issues, of course, was not just information asymmetry, but also and lower access to food, livelihoods, high male migration, but very importantly, the whole physical destructions, social devaluation, exclusion of the indigenous food and nutrition knowledges and practices from formal institutions, whether it is schools, whether it is Anganwadis, whether it is health centers, and so on. So this is where we decided to actually focus our intervention. Next, please. We used a participatory action research approach where we collected some baseline data in these particular contexts, and then along with the communities using a range of participatory methods, working really with youth groups and women's groups, tried to develop interventions to address some of these issues, working also with multiple stakeholders. Next, please. So this was in the Santhal Parganas, where we worked with these youth groups, and it was very interesting because we started this just before COVID, and we did a training with them on participatory filmmaking, and we had given them cameras as well and told them that, we're working on food systems transformation. Then COVID came in March 2020. This was February 2020, and then we couldn't go back. But these young people, actually, they use the cameras to develop to shoot a lot of films. And they made about 100 films recording various kinds of local foods which they were consuming, aloe vera which they were using for hand wash because of its properties during COVID-19 when they couldn't afford soap, and so on. Uh, then they then started using this sort of spreading it through theater, wall paintings, but also we had a digital phone, the IVRS, interactive voice response system, which we worked with Gram Vani and set up a platform on that. So they were using that also to share. Next, please. We then used some of this thing that was documented by them through their films and so on. There were almost more than 150 recipes which came up with the films and with the mobile voice response, where people could respond in relation to questions asked and give their own recipes and so on. So all out of local produce, because that was the time when the markets were not working. So we shortlisted out of this 150 recipes for nutritional analysis. We collaborated with a nutritional NGO called NEDPRO Global Health Center for Nutrition and Health. And then finally fine-tuned into 37 recipes based on all locally available foods, which were available, acceptable, popular, and so on, assess them for their nutritive values. And we have just produced this recipe book, which is translated into Santhali with recommended meal templates, where we give the nutritive value of each of their recipes and how they can combine them in order to fulfill their required dietary intake of various micro and macronutrients. As I said at the start, there still remains some shortfall in terms of protein. So one of the things that comes out of this analysis is that we need to continue advocacy for eggs or other sources of protein, which the state can provide through social protection measures. Next, please. Various other creative outputs for children. We converted some of these local knowledges because there's a huge resistance with these boarding schools and children being taken away from their local context. They really have got totally alienated from their local knowledge, their local environment, and so on. So how do we address that? Next, please. And also we developed a course, actually a 4-credit course with IGNU, which is on their SWAYAM platform. It was in English. We have translated it last year into Hindi as well. And this really emerged from a feedback which we got from frontline workers, especially Ashas and Anganwadi workers, saying that they lack adequate training on food security and nutrition. This was confirmed by the central agency in Delhi and so on, to say that they have so much curriculum and not enough time for training. So they are mainly taught about drugs. The Asha workers and Anganwadi workers, of course, don't have any proper training except their monthly meetings. So this was something which has been set up and is ongoing and running with the IGNU, moderated by IGNU. Next, please. So I think this is really my last thing. There are a couple of recommendations which I don't need to go to, but I think with all this, it comes back that if you're moving towards gender justice and addressing sort of issues of social equity and unequal power relations in food and nutrition security, I think some of the principles which the women's movement has been arguing for in terms of recognition of women, in terms of redistribution as agricultural workers, particularly in terms of redistributing the care deficit by better public support, and also women's representation and voice, listening to them in extension services and so on, is very key. Next, please. And these were just a couple of points to summarize that, that we have in India very good, like the National Policy on Farmers, which says that all women or anybody who undertakes any agricultural activity, and there's a very broad definition, should be recognized as agricultural workers, farmers. And they had asked that the panchayats or the local bodies be empowered to actually give some kind of card or registration as agricultural workers so that they can get other benefits in terms of assets and so on. Unfortunately, the Panchayati Raj institutions seem to have become mere implementers of central government schemes rather than actually taking the initiative in terms of such kind of registration of women workers as agricultural workers. Next. And And the other interesting thing that we found this time and always over the last several years, that in terms of extension is again very top down. They have schemes that you can promote millets or you promote these paddy varieties. So they give the inputs, they give the seeds and so on for particular things. But there is a real mismatch between what women are doing, women controlled crops like horse gram or vegetables. If women are doing, there is no kind of corresponding extension support. So I think this match is needed. And this time when I was talking to extension workers in Dumka in Jharkhand, they said that this has to come from above, that they are very cognizant that women are doing things for which there is no support. But unfortunately, until and unless the orders come from above, they're not able to provide that kind of very tailored support for women farmers. Next, please. And social protection, as I've already said, I think I cannot emphasize enough that this is very, very important, not just the PDS and expansion of the food basket, but also initiatives to reduce drudgery and time poverty, like clean cooking energy, drinking water, which works, and so on. Unfortunately, the cooking gas, the Ujjwala scheme, I was in Jharkhand, women have one cylinder, which they were given originally, but this has never been replaced because of both its expense and the difficulties of access. And I think the other very important thing is on Anganwadis to actually perform or provide quality childcare services and feeding services, especially in peak seasons. Next, please. And that's my last. I think I have said more or less that we need very much for research, much more differentiated analysis, much more mixed methods research that not just focus on quantitative data, but also in terms of understanding the impacts of culture and norms. And for policy, I think to also take data seriously. I think this is something that as academics and researchers, we have been saying that policy should be framed on the basis of data. Unfortunately, this is not really happening. And if that happens, I think we can move towards much greater both gender sensitivity and justice, as well as nutrition security. Thanks very much. And I'm sorry I've taken little extra time. There are some references at the end.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Rao. That was really interesting and really fascinating. Especially, I think people have a general sense of how agriculture and nutrition are connected. But I think it was really interesting how you brought in agricultural labor and how it affects nutrition of both women and children.